Oh, okay, great, we're on. All right, so I'm very excited to introduce our second keynote for SysML, or MLSys, sorry. So today we have Shafi Goldwasser, who is the director of the Simmons Institute for the Theory of Computing, as well as a professor at UC Berkeley, at MIT, and Weizmann Institute of Science in Israel. She has received numerous awards, notably, for instance, the ACM Turing Award in 2012. And she's also a member of AAAS, the National Academy of Engineering, National Academy of Science, and many more. And she's been well recognized for her work in cryptography, including awards for her work in interactive proofs and connections to approximation. With that, please take it away. All right, 1 second. Hello, hi. So I'll get started and we'll see how this works. In fact, this is fine, just it's fine. So the topic of my talk is cryptography for safe machine learning. And let me just start by saying that I'm actually in training a cryptographer and a theorist and a complexity theorist. And I've seen over the years, I've graduated in 1983 or something. Over years, the really, actually there's no place to walk, I would fall off the stage. So I might as well stay here. The surprising consequences of very basic and theoretical research in cryptography for things like electronic commerce, how would you be able to point here? Point to where? But I have to be near the screen? Okay. All right, so you're going to have to use your imagination. So electronic commerce, cryptocurrency these days, people talk about zero knowledge proofs, or even the mere possibility of doing cryptocurrency and having a blockchain requires cryptography, cloud computing. Okay, cloud computing and even quantum computing, in some sense, has had a lot of push, and probably there's so much interest in it over the years because of the paper of Peter Shor that showed that factoring, or the RSA algorithm, is insecure against quantum computers that at the time were just a theoretical model, weren't even considered to be built. And in addition to that, there's been a lot of theoretical work that came out of cryptography in complexity theory about pseudo-randomness and about the whole notion of how do you verify a proof. And I guess the point of my talk is that I think that the next frontier for cryptography, and that's talking from the point of view of a cryptographer, is to dedicate the tools that we've developed and develop new tools for addressing problems in the safety of machine learning. And during this talk, I hope to convince you of that. And in fact, the talk is going to be 2 parts. The first part is very short. The second part is the more interesting one, but I think it's interesting to get the historical context. So this relationship between cryptography and machine learning is not new. It started in the 80s, where in some sense, it was sort of at odds with each other. So if you show that one task was difficult for machine learning, that was great for cryptography, and the other way around. But in the second part of the talk, I'll show you that actually they seem to work very well together now. And not only that, I would say that this topic of how to make trustworthy AI or safe machine learning is really an opportunity for cryptography. It's the perfect place to use a lot of cryptographic tools and also to extend them. So, this is a conference on MLSys. I'm actually outside of both of the fields. But so for me, I want to think about machine learning in the most childish, abstract way possible and still show you what we can do. So they learn lots of models, lots of application domains, but let's just think about it as if there's a magic box in which is written some formula or some algorithm which defines the hypothesis class. In this case, it's just some formula with ands and ors, locked in a black box. But it turns out that if you knew what's written there, you would be able to diagnose tumors and figure out whether emails were spam or whether students should be admitted to college. If you think about these variables as describing an essay, or should a bank loan be approved, and so forth. Okay, but for me, it's going to be this black box, and that's the way I'm going to treat it, independent of application. Obviously, we'd all like to figure out this box. For any one of these applications would be a huge success. And the first thing is that we need to sort of define it. As a theoretician, first thing we want to define, in fact, I think all of us agree with that. And the definition that I'm sort of starting with is the first one that I've seen, which is sort of came from the theory community, obviously. This is a field that was around before by Les Valiant, okay? And there's sort of two things that I need to explicitly define and pay attention to. And first of all, what is the information that I have on this formula in the hidden box? That is, can I just see samples of setting of the variables x1, x2, x3, and the value that the box gives the formula defined over those x1, x2, x3? Can I ask questions, membership queries? You know, maybe I know part of this box. And the second thing is, what do we even mean by success? Is success to learn the formula C exactly? Is it to learn approximately? Is it to generate another box that's similar to C? Could be lots of ways that you could define success here, or maybe explain properties of C, that C is linear or C is nonlinear, or if C is a distribution, what is the mean of that distribution, and so forth. So Valiant, in his original paper, takes the following approach. He's really looking at the problem. You're giving examples of the C taken from some distribution, so values of the variable X, taken from some distribution D, which you don't know, in the original paper at least, and then you are given, and the box gives you answers. It picks the X and it gives you the value of the box C on X, the concept on X. And then he says, if I am able to get a lot of examples of this sort, successful machine learning, or what he called a pack learning algorithm, has the following property. Pack for probably, I'm preaching to the converts, but still I want to put things in context for my talk. So he wants it to be probably and approximately correct, which means the probability that the hypothesis you come up with as the learner is very far from that box, is less than epsilon. So the probability they disagree is less than epsilon, and that is true. That event of low disagreement is true with high probability. So there's an epsilon, which is a disagreement, and there's a delta, which is the probability of mistake. Obviously, you want epsilon to be small and delta to be small, okay? So this is, lots of variations of this over the years. I think in the original paper, he wanted to learn a hypothesis which was exactly the same class as C. So if it was a DNF formula, it still would be a DNF formula. Now we care, I think I would care about agnostic learning. So any algorithm, as long as it achieves what's in the box, is okay with me. Could be a more powerful algorithm that's one in the box. And we look at all kinds of distributions. The test distribution might be different than the training distribution, and we still want to do well enough, you know, provided that they're not different enough. In fact, we would like to do it for all distributions. Okay, great. So this is the concept. And Valiant's paper was very optimistic to begin with. But what I'm talking about in the first part of the talk are pessimistic news that cryptography delivered very quickly after Valiant papers came out. So after it came out, you know, people were immediately asking, wait a second, this is an ambitious goal. How well can you do, really? Are there some concepts, some black boxes that it's impossible to learn? You're just not going to be able to do it, you know, with a small epsilon and delta. You're going to be incorrect, let's say, much more than you are willing to accept. And Valiant was at Harvard, and there's a big crypto group at MIT at the time, especially Rivest and Valiant were friends. And very quickly, probably because they were so close to each other, this result came out. This was by Valiant and Kearns, which said, you know, if in fact RSA, secure RSA, if RSA is secure, then that would imply immediately a concept which is actually kind of low complexity, low level complexity class, not a very sophisticated concept, okay, which is not pack learnable. That if we're just going to see samples of this thing, we're not going to be able to learn it. Just forget it. This is a low, this gives a bound on what you can do, an upper bound on what you can do. So this was a wonderful bliss for cryptography, not so good news for ML. Of course, these might not be the kind of concepts you want to learn, but it just shows that there are simple concepts and simple complexity classes that cannot be learned if cryptography existed in the sense that RSA was hard to break. Can you hear me now? Okay. Wonderful. And in fact, it wasn't just showing hardness results for labeling, like pack learning, but also for generation. So a few years afterwards, there was a work by Kearns and a few other people, which said, suppose the box has a distribution, and all I want to do is come up with another box that comes up with a similar distribution. So sort of if you think about a GANs or something, that might be sort of a modern version of that. And the question there was, can you do that? Is that an easier job, or maybe it's a harder job than labeling? And again, there was a result from cryptography fairly soon after that shows if there exist secure digital signatures, you could define a box, okay, where you could sort of verify even that it's coming from the right distribution, even though you got a box that you could verify coming from concepts or label or the examples coming out of that box, you won't be able to mimic it. So again, from cryptography, you get a negative result. So it seems like, you know, in this case, cryptography is just delivering bad news to machine learning. But soon after, there was this paper in machine learning, okay, that they published in a crypto conference, very interesting paper, whose goal was to say, you know what, all right, but your problems are from number theory, you know, breaking RSA, digital signatures. What we're going to do now is going to show you a problem that's natural for us in machine learning at the time. And we can't solve it. Maybe you can use it as a basis for cryptography. So they're sort of returning the favor to the other side. And in fact, their paper explicitly says, this is Blum, Lipton, a bunch of other papers, it says, other people, it says, we're going to give you, he says it's true that virtually every interactability result in Valiant's model comes from cryptography. But in this paper, we're going to give results in the reverse direction by showing how to construct several cryptographic primitives based on certain assumptions on the difficulty of learning. And which problem and the difficulty of learning they were talking about is learning parity with noise. Again, those of you coming from applications, which I assume is probably most of the people in this conference, it's again a theoretical problem, but it's a theoretical problem that was studied extensively and has been studied extensively in the learning community and not in the crypto community. In a minute, we'll see that that suggestion was incredibly useful for cryptographers. And in fact, a lot of modern cryptography, like homomorphic encryption and so forth, rests on extensions of this problem. So what is this problem? Again, learning parity with noise is the following problem. There's some secret. It's a binary vector, S1, S2, S3, some variables. Let's say n-dimensional vector. But these S's, they are known. And what I do know is I have values of equations in these n variables, and I might have lots and lots and lots of equations, except I don't have correct solutions. I have solutions which are a little noisy. So rather than, you know, you're solving these equations mod 2, there should be zeros and ones on the right-hand side, except sometimes they're flipped with some noise. That's the learning problem. Can you learn these S's, and for how much noise can you learn it? And it turned out it's a very, very difficult problem. You can barely do anything. Okay, so you can barely do anything for reasonable noises, and the best algorithm that's out there is exponential. It's Blum-Klein-Wasserman from 2003 is the best one, to the order n over log n, where n is the number of variables that I mentioned. Okay, so now what happened, which was revolutionary to cryptography, is that a few years later, Oded Regev said the following. Okay, so we have this problem. It's an interesting problem. You can do some crypto with it, not a lot. So it was a good suggestion. We could do some cryptography with it. But if we change that problem that came from learning a bit more, we're going to be able to do tons with it. So how did he change it? He said, you know what? Instead of thinking of S1 through Sn as Boolean variables, let's take them over finite fields. Okay, so they are, it's vectors over finite fields. And the equations now are solved mod p for some prime. So the finite field is f sub p. And now there are a bunch of equations. And again, there's an error on the right-hand side, because otherwise we could do Gaussian elimination and find out all the variables. There's errors, but the errors now are not just flipping, because these are values in FP, so you add Gaussian noise to the right-hand side. So obviously this is no easier than the learning parity with noise, because that one is a special case, but it turns out that now you can prove all kinds of things about it, and you can do all kinds of things with it. So the best algorithm is still exponential, but in addition to that, you can show that this is as hard to solve as some kind of well-known problems in geometry, which it has to do with integer lattices and finding short vectors in or even approximation of short vectors in integer lattices. And I don't want to get into it, but it's a kind of a well-studied problem. And now all of a sudden, this problem that came from learning, when you make it, you generalize it, is equivalent to some geometry problem a lot of mathematicians have studied. It also has some worst case to average properties, which is wonderful for cryptography. So it's not just hard in the worst case, but it's actually hard on an average case, which is sort of much more interesting for use of cryptography, and also much more interesting for an audience such as yourself. Still, the best known algorithm is exponential. I mean, one can do 2 to the n over log n. Okay, so far all I've taught you is a small course in computational learning theory, which says there's this relationship. You can show negative results for learning. And in the opposite direction, we use a learning problem to come up with a new problem that's been very useful for crypto. In fact, it's been sort of revolutionary. So it's the basis of this, the hardness of this problem gives you the basis for homomorphic encryption, for leakage resilient cryptography, for lots of other wonderful things which have cryptographic strength, which we don't know how to do with RSA. We don't know how to do with traditional cryptography. And in fact, it has also quantum significance. So as you know, a lot of companies, a lot of countries are sort of rushing toward building some quantum computers that can do things which are supreme to what can be done classically. There are claims to one side, to the other, but it's a goal. So much so that the National Institute of Standards and the NSA said, you know, we have to prepare to this eventuality that these computers 10, 20 years down the line will be able to crack better than we can do now in classical computers, cryptographic systems. And what they call it is post-quantum cryptography. So the reason this is relevant here is because this new crypto that's based on lattices, which came from that machine learning problem through a sequence of steps, is actually quantum resilient in the sense that we know of no quantum algorithms like we do for RSA that break them. The best algorithms which are quantum are also exponential. And in fact, interestingly, you know, we have, Vivian mentioned that I'm now the director of the Simons Institute. Right now in the Simons Institute, we have these programs where we study specific topics and we have a lot of visitors that come. The 2 programs that are running right now are these 2 logos on my slide. One of them is called Lattices, Algorithms, Complexity, and Cryptography. And the other one is the quantum wave in computing. So half the people are from studying quantum and half the people are studying crypto-based lattices. And in some sense, they have an interesting match there because obviously the quantum algorithms people want to have ways to break lattice-based cryptography, whereas the crypto people would be very happy to show that that's hard, and then they can use the lattice-based the lattice problems as more and more of a basis. And there's an interesting question of what are the parameters exactly, where these ones can't break and these ones can use. Okay, in any case, so this is history. It seems like, and this ends the first part of my talk, is, I don't know, you're very young here. Well, not all of you, but there was this character called Debbie Downer from Saturday Night Live many years ago. And it was like, no matter what you said, it was like, well, you know, it's not so good. So it really is not a very good story because we want positive results. But in the second part of this talk, I'll show you that actually impossibility results in learning and in general in complexity, which are the basis for cryptography, are very, very good news, very positive news for if you wanted to make machine learning safe. Okay, and now I have to define what I mean by safe. So we'll get there in a few minutes. So this is the second part of the talk. So we all know that availability of data has changed the faces of machine learning, and it affects lots of fields of study, health, finance, economic growth, infrastructure, vision, NLP, security, threat prediction model, spam, policing, bail, credit rating, you know, it just keeps coming. Whether it's really, you know, the most advanced machine learning or some much simpler models, doesn't matter. The point is that you can do a lot with these models when you have a lot of data to completely change the face of these application areas. However, at the same time, it means that there is sort of a sudden shift of power from who had the power before, in the sense that it seems that data gives a lot of power to those who hold it. And in fact, these are old icons, but so it might be that it's illegal now, but there was an algorithm that was helping set bail in New Jersey. I think in California now they're saying there's going to be, you know, the law has passed, so there's no cash bail, and it's mandated there will be algorithms that will decide whether you go on bail or not. There's a big call out for companies that will implement those algorithms. They want those algorithms to be black box, can you imagine? And then there's another call for companies who will verify that those first companies' algorithms work well. But the point is that the power is moving to the hands not only to who has the data, but whoever is defining and coming up with the algorithm based on the data. And same thing with where you send the police cars or how do you give loans and so forth. This is just a sort of a slide which I think is interesting, where you kind of see the companies that had power a few years back and the ones who have now sort of going from oil companies to data companies. But that's a well-known trajectory at this point. And there is this quote, right? The data will become the new currency or a currency. So this sudden shift of power leaves us, in my mind, very unprotected, very unregulated, which is great for research because we can do whatever we like, but it's not, you know, we can't just keep going this way. So what I mean by safe machine learning is that I want to ensure that the power of machine learning and ML algorithm is not abused. So in other words, that's a very informal definition. And the way that I'll make it more formal is not by giving one definition that encompasses all the issues about safety in machine learning. I'll give you a sequence of challenges that I think need to be addressed in order to get what I call safe machine learning. And I'll also show you that cryptographic results for privacy and correctness of computation. So very important is that there's a lot of cryptographic work on how to ensure correctness of computation when the adversaries are present. So not just privacy, but actually the thing is working correctly, even if there's sort of malicious adversaries controlling the data or the model. And using these results can go a long way toward this non-abuse goal. All right, so now I'm going to go through a sequence of challenges and some work that others and I have done to address them and some open problems. So the first challenge is kind of clear, and that is, since the power of machine learning, at least the way it seems right now, comes from data, okay? This might change, but it comes from data of individuals. Then maybe in the future, we're going to need very little data. Right now, it seems that for generality, we do need lots of data. Then we want to ensure that the privacy of both the data and the model during both training of machine models, which in Valiant's case is just getting those examples, and classifying, when someone is actually using the box in order to get, or the hypothesis to get classification. And the goal is basically you want to maintain power. You want to maintain power and value of your models. So, oh, I see that I didn't delete what I wanted. Okay, so let's just jump here. I just want this challenge to be on this slide. And I want to say that there's lots and lots of work in this field about how to do that during training, during classification. People talk about model stealing, how to make sure that your model is not stolen by someone else who has the ability to use it for a temporary part of time, temporary usage. And I will talk about this at the end, but I want to talk about some other things which are sort of less obvious. And that is this goal, which is less obvious as a goal, not less obvious as a solution. And the second goal is I want the models to be able to check that the models have not been tampered, either for bias or for profit. And I can see sort of three directions of work. The first one is the one that I've been involved with recently, and that is to come up with a method where whoever learned a machine learning model is able to convince someone else or to prove to another party who is much less has much fewer resources, less access to data, maybe less access to high quality data, but they're able to prove that their machine learning that they came is really compatible and is the best thing that can be done with the data that's available. Okay, so this is work that's completely motivated and inspired by cryptographic model of interactive proofs, where there's sort of a prover who's more powerful. In this case, it's going to be a learner, and someone who wants to verify the claims of the learner. Okay, and I'll say a few words about this in the next few slides, but it's not the only direction. Obviously, much earlier than that, there's work on optimization and machine learning, is how to develop methods to minimize the influence of maliciously chosen training data. So it's more of an optimization problem. And the systems level, you have to develop, of course, secure infrastructures to run models to make sure that they're not tamperable, that they're correct, and so forth. So, but going back to the cryptography, here's the picture. So first of all, this is joint work with Guy Rothblum, Emilio Dayoff, and Jonathan Schaefer. Jonathan Schaefer is a student at Berkeley, and a lot of work is his, and it's fantastic. He's a great student. And the idea here is the following. There are two parties. There are these two boxes, right? Can you see when I have the cursor here? Oh, amazing. Okay, that's how okay. So there's the learner on one side, and then there's the verifier on the other side. We think of the learner as a big company that has lots and lots of data. or that has very sophisticated learning abilities, and the verifier is a client. And there's a distribution, and they both have access to it. And they might go through a conversation at the end of which the verifier says, you know, I accept the hypothesis you're trying to sell me, or this thing that's in the black box that you claim that you've developed as the right black box to determine bail by, or I reject. And what's an example of it? An example might be not only in the context that you think of this learner as someone who's selling their services, you might even think that I'm a verifier, I just don't have too many resources, so I outsource this problem to some very powerful server, and the server goes on and collects very high quality data, trains good machine learning model, says, here, I've done it. How do you know I've done it? Should you accept it? Shouldn't you accept it? How much effort is it going to be for you to do it? Do you have to collect data yourself, train a model yourself, and then compare it? You know, that's a very interesting question. How many resources would verifying cost versus learning? Is verifying cheaper than learning? And again, the thing to kind of keep in your mind is that I'm thinking of access to the distribution, access to data as a resource. And it could be that it's a very costly resource, and the verifier not only doesn't have time to process large amounts of data, but he might actually have a different quality of data. So it's not just a quantitative question, but also a qualitative question. So for example, remember in the past, I talked about membership queries versus random samples of that box, the C box in the beginning. You could ask it questions, or you could just get examples of it. Maybe the verifier can only get samples, and the learner could actually ask questions and so forth. So if you think about a medical field, it's like running medical experiments, and then later you want to actually verify that, that the claim is that this is a good model for diagnosis or even cure. You're not going to run the experiments again, but you do have some access to all data. Okay, so the new notion that you could define, and we define in this work, is pack verification. So whereas before there was pack learning, we want to talk about pack verification. So what do we want from pack verification? We want to say that a hypothesis class is pack verifiable if there is actually a prover and a verifier. This is P and V. This is math symbols, but I'm talking it out, so you don't necessarily have to look at it, such that if in fact you will say that a hypothesis class is pack verifiable, if there exists a protocol between a learner and a verifier, such that when indeed it's possible to learn, and possible to learn with epsilon error compared to the optimal algorithm, okay, so let's say compared to what's in the box, you know, the probability of what I've given you is different than what's in the box. I want the probability of that, the difference between them to be less than epsilon, the probability greater than 1 minus delta. So that's just like variance definition, except now it's for verifying. And then the more interesting requirement is I want to make sure that it's also sound. So in other words, if this guy is not telling me the truth, and there is a much better hypothesis than what he's given me, so I'm far away by epsilon, then I will reject with high probability. Okay? Great. So, and I want this to be doubly efficient. What do I mean by that? I want that in order to prove to me these results, the learner doesn't have to work much harder than it was to learn, and the verifier has to work a lot less than it was to learn. Everybody with me? What my goal is? Very natural goal is just setting it in math. And it turns out that, it's especially interesting for the agnostic case, because when it's the non-agnostic case, it's kind of an easy problem, is that we can actually show positive results, negative too, but more interesting positive in this context. And what we show is that if you let, for functions which are t-sparse in the Fourier basis, so they only have few large Fourier coefficients. So this concept comes up a lot in compressed sensing and so forth. But for these Boolean functions, under that parity with noise, assuming that parity with noise is a hard problem, so we're going to use crypto inside of this result, it is going to be possible to pack verify functions of this form in such a way that the prover will need to, sorry, 2 points. Point 1, these class of functions, the sparse T functions, are very hard to learn if you had random samples. That's well known under the hardness of this learning parity with noise. So that's hopeless to get random samples and learn it. But so we're going to let the learner ask membership queries, because with membership queries, we can actually learn it. So we're going to let the learner ask membership queries of this function. So we could say x and get f of x for these type of functions. However, the verifier is only going to get random samples. And we will show how the prover can convince the verifier that in spite of the fact that he has more power and more time and a better access model, that the hypothesis he gives him for the function is close plus minus epsilon. And they're going to run efficiently. And interestingly, I think the most interesting part about this is that it uses two-way interaction. What does that mean? The prover is going to send a hypothesis, the verifier is going to interrogate him, and then the prover is going to give answers. And if he's going to give sort of the incorrect answers, you will catch him with good probability. Okay, so that's all I want to say about this model verification, because it's new and probably haven't seen. What's a third challenge? So a third challenge is adversarial learning, right? So adversarial learning, everybody's talking about it. Like, what about if someone corrupts some of the training data? What if someone asks you to classify something that's very different, or been manipulated? And the examples people always look at is, you know, the car examples or the stop sign, where the human eye, the ground truth is obvious to you that this is a stop sign, but the machine learning algorithm will think that it's a yield sign. But we want to talk about this theoretically. So what do you do about this? So here's sort of the picture, right? There's an adversary, and he has access to this box. So in this case, the adversary just can use the box for classifying. Sometimes the adversary is the one who actually helped create this box. It gave bad training examples. And as far as I know, the current machine learning work always obeys the following blueprint, where you say, let's assume some restriction on the adversary. You can't just give me any crazy classifying examples. But if I know that what he does is he takes sort of good examples and then manipulates them, and when you do manipulates, if you think about vision, you know, it maybe does flips and rotations. So there's some restricted set of operations that you think the adversary can do, then for that kind of adversary, I can develop a machine learning model that will be robust against adversarial machine learning. So there's an assumption here that the adversary in some sense is a good guy. Well, not really good, but he's not the worst. Now, if you think about cryptography, we never make those assumptions. I mean, if we do, we're not happy about it. So we want to consider an efficient adversary, and that we have no idea what his algorithm is. We don't know if he does rotations and flips. He may do all kinds of things. Maybe we wouldn't say he runs only in linear time or quadratic time or polynomial time, but other than that, I don't know what he's doing. So it'd be great to get results for such a general adversary. So in this new work with Adam Kalai, Yael Kalai, and Omar Montasser, which is in submission, what we do is this. So I think it's best illustrated by this picture. So suppose you have some very simple problem here where people give you plus examples and negative. There's some sort of threat. You need to know sort of what's you want to classify after getting positive test data, train data and negative train data. These new points, are they positive or negative? They're black points, okay, that I've just put in. But these black points, they were given by an adversary. So this, for right now, just the adversary is doing classifying. So he may give it in some regions which you really have no idea if it's going to be plus or minus. In fact, there's no way if he just gives it in regions which you've never, that it comes from a distribution which you've never seen, that you'll be able to classify it correctly. Because this line might not be right. It might be completely the totally vertical line and so forth. So, so that's why this guy is so unhappy. So what we do here is we say, okay, let's relax the goal, okay? We're going to relax the goal and say, you know, sometimes you say, I can't do it, okay? But when you say you can do it, you do it well. So in other words, we're going to relax. We're not going to say classify on everything. We say either unclassifiable or you give a plus or minus. And the requirement isn't that you always say unclassifiable. There's no definition of when you say unclassifiable. The definition is that you want to be very low error, okay, for one, and two, to do as well as possible in the sense just not reject everything, that it's unclassifiable. So you need a way to measure what it means that you have good utility and good accuracy when you do classify things. And so it's an easier problem because we allow no prediction, right? Say on this on these guys, which you have never seen anything, or these guys out here, you may allow no prediction. So that was a simple kind of example. It could be harder. It could be that these points are lying in the sort of like a circular outlying of where the plus and minuses are, and you want to deal with those as well. And the results that we get are that when you allow this relaxation, which is an easier setting, you can do away with problems of previous works, and in particular the problem that restricts the power of the adversary. So you can say, I'm not assuming the adversary is just doing flips or rotations or whatever, depending on your domain. I'll let any adversarial power. That's not the point. And I can come up with an algorithm where will be efficient. Actually, in the supervised case, it's reduction to empirical risk minimization. And whenever that's successful, so is ours. And it's inefficient when it's unsupervised. And in both of these cases, you tolerate some noise. And the more important thing is that the trade-off between the error you get and the utility is actually very good. It's sort of what you optimally would expect. Okay, so this was misclassification, like adversarial machine learning. And my point about cryptography is that thinking like a cryptographer, I think, is useful, that you sort of don't rest with the situation where you restrict the adversary. Rather than that, you'd like to change the definition and get the best possible. And in some sense, the best possible would be when I can't predict, at least I want to know that I can't predict. So if you're thinking about sort of YouTube examples and somebody sending you new YouTubes and they have to be screened, they're not pornographic or contain hate or whatever, that it's okay to reject it, but you need to recognize when it is that and rejection is an okay thing, and when it is that you want to label correctly, or when it is that things are unpredictable. Okay. The holy grail, obviously, would be not to relax the model, not to relax this prediction. It's always classify, plus and minus, and be as close as possible to the truth, and never reject. But I think that holy grail might be, too hard. So there are, in fact, results. I think there's more results than this, but this is a bunch of results from Waterloo by Mahmoudi et al. Mahmoudi actually is in Berkeley now, he's a postdoc there, which show that if you can tamper some of the training data, and then it's even a small fraction of it, it's pretty impossible not to allow the adversary to completely throw you off in the classification stage. But again, this is in a model where it's not the new model where we relax our goal. And interestingly, the reason I have so much text on this slide is, one, because I shouldn't, but two, just want to test if you're awake. And two, because the proof of these impossibility results comes up actually from some results from cryptography about the inability to not bias a coin. So you sort of think about the classification task and the fact that it is like biasing some distribution. And what is shown is that you can always bias a distribution, and that in turn is equivalent to saying that there's a negative result of your ability to avoid misclassification in the presence of an adversary. Okay, 4, we'd like to trace the unauthorized use of our data and our model. So someone, did a lot of work, we collected a lot of data might be private, and somebody goes and steals all my stuff. I'd like to be able to at least, I don't know if I can prevent it, which would be, I guess, a system approach would be like putting walls around it or doing something else. But how about just relaxing again and talking about tracing? And there's some work in progress that I'm involved in for, data tracing. And some other work that's relevant to this, which will appear in Eurocrypt 2020, is that in the context of GDPR, which I'm sure you all heard about, where they say that your data should be private, they also want this ability data to be forgotten. It's called the right to be forgotten. So they want somehow in the future to have a way that, let's say, a company that's gotten information about you, you can request that they will delete it. So there's a question, why is this related here? Because if you think about it, if there's no way to delete it, then how are they not going to have a trace? But if you are requiring people not to, you have to have an ability to kind of what's the right word? Delete so it cannot be traced. So there's a whole work about what does it mean to delete? How do you define that there is a trace and there isn't a trace? And this is in the context of GDPR. And I think that there's a lot of interesting work to be done, and I think some of it has already been done on deletion for machine learning algorithm. Suppose there's a lot of data, your algorithm, your machine learning model was based on this data, and now a bunch of people pull their data away. Can you change your machine learning algorithm so that it's not reflected in the algorithm anymore, their data? So the machine learning algorithm has to change. You don't want to retrain it from the beginning. You just want to kind of erase it. One answer is to use differential privacy, which probably a lot of people have heard about, which is to begin with, you were training in such a way that you can't trace people's data. But then the effectiveness of the model is weaker. Okay, what's another challenge? There's a lot of talk these days, and it's a very important topic about fairness, accountability, de-biasing, how to make sure that these algorithms are fair. So they might be correct on everyone, but small minority groups. And the question is how you define them. Do you define them like they are defined like protected groups? Do you define them as subsets of certain sizes? Do you define them as subsets that are recognizable by an algorithm? And then how do you change your algorithm to be fair to all these groups? And those definitions these days are usually, there's sort of a lot of argument about what's the right definition of fairness. And there's many definitions, sometimes they contradict, they're making progress. But from cryptography again, speaking of a cryptographer, you know, an interesting thing is rather than try to define fairness is to use sort of cryptographic type definitions, which are simulation based. And I'm not going to get into what that means, but it's rather than talking about it, that all groups have to be treated similarly, you have a different kind of definition. Whereas that if you see what the algorithm does on several groups, you, in some sense, you can't tell the difference rather than there is no difference. But again, subject to a full other talk. Another question is randomness. Who generates the randomness for the machine learning algorithm? And how important is it that it's truly random and unpredictable? How important are the secrecy of those random coins? So I think that's a very untapped area. Maybe secrecy is not important, maybe it is. And how is it generated? You know, because at the end, often, if we're talking about the privacy of a model and we know all the randomness and all the data, it's not clear how you could talk about privacy. But possibly if you didn't know the randomness, you might not be able to duplicate a model. Finally, probably the more interesting challenge is to define some specialized machine learning functionalities, which are complete for machine learning, and then focus on implementing those. And that could be in hardware and systems, but just say these are the higher level primitives, and now we're going to design our machine learning in terms of that, okay? And why I'm mentioning it here in the context of cryptography is because if you could make them cryptographic friendly, so you could also impose what you want in terms of cryptography, then it would be much easier to define, to add security to machine learning algorithm. Because right now, and that brings me to my next topic, if you go back to my first challenge about privacy, where most of the work is done, where I didn't really tell you what's done, the problem is that you take an existing machine learning algorithm, let's say uses ReLUs or whatever is the nonlinear operations in the context of deep learning, and now you try to make it so it's preserves the privacy of the data. When you classify, maybe preserve the privacy of the data that you use to train it. And if you'd like to sort of encrypt the data and do the training on encrypted data, or encrypt the data and do the classifying on encrypted data, it's very hard because you need the kind of encryption where these operations are easy to do on encrypted data. And if those operations are kind of unfriendly to crypto, it's going to be inefficient and people won't do it. So one way is that the cryptographers would work harder, and the other way is that the ML people would work harder to make their models more friendly to crypto. But in any case, it means that they need to work together. So I just want to say a few things about what's done these days on the privacy, and then I'll end. I have no idea what time it is. I'm okay? Oh, okay, good. So lots of work, and I'm not going to do justice to a lot of it. So first thing to say is that this work, by and large, uses tools of the past. So in other words, there's a whole bunch of crypto tools which have been developed since the 80s. The pictures here are, this is something called garbled circuits, homomorphic encryption. Homomorphic encryption is kind of a newcomer, but multi-party computation, secret sharing, differential privacy, these were developed not in the context of machine learning, but you can use them off the shelf. Now, as often is the case, when you use something off the shelf, it doesn't necessarily exactly work the way you want it. So people tweak it. And I'll tell you a little bit of the tweaks that people do. So let's look at there are two machineries that are most important kind of to keep in your head as I go through the next few slides. One is this thing that I call multi-party computation. I know some of you are familiar, some of you less. The idea here, there's a lot of users, each have data sets, and there's this universal theorem that was developed in the 80s and then became more and more efficient over the years that says even if these data centers don't trust each other, they can send messages back and forth and somehow compute together some functions, big F here, which is a function on all their data via distributed protocol without revealing the data to each other. but they will all know the result at the end, but they won't know each other's data. Of course, the result might say something about somebody's data, but besides that, in your own data, you learn nothing else. And this result is even robust for collusions of these centers with each other against others. And this has gotten a lot of attention, so much so that there's even a definition in a bill to Congress, which says the term secure multi-party computation means a computerized system that enables different participating entities in possession of private sets of data to link and aggregate their data set for the exclusive purpose of performing a finite number of pre-approved computations without transferring or otherwise revealing any private data to each other. So this is human language, you know, one can understand it. Well, sort of, I mean, if you think that Congress is human. But in any case, and the other tool, which is become sort of newer, is this thing called fully homomorphic encryption, where you have a way for a client to sort of lock his data or encrypt it and send it to another party, could be a cloud, which can execute programs on this encrypted, so run a security model, sorry, a machine learning model on the data and send it to you encrypted. The client has the key, so he could decrypt this. The thing is that it sounds beautiful, but almost anybody that has heard about it and doesn't know the current development says, but it's inefficient. So I come here to say to you that that's not true. It's true for very complicated computations, but there's a lot of computations these days that can be done efficiently. So there's been a huge development in this field. And okay, so we have these two tools, multi-party computation and homomorphic encryption, okay? And now let's say that we have an application. There's a doctor that wants to use on her client's private data some model developed by some hospital. The doctor is some rural area, the hospital is some big, I don't know, UCSF, MGH hospital that doesn't want to give his model away, and she doesn't want to give her client's data away. And they want to run a machine learning diagnosis algorithm. So they both have security concerns. One doesn't want their data to be, of their patient to be revealed. The other one doesn't want the model to be revealed. And you can think about this as sort of a two-party protocol, right? There are two parties, they both have data. They want to compute something, which is the diagnosis, and they want to make sure that their own proprietary data, it could be an algorithm or records, remain private. And now they can employ two methods. One is the secure multi-party computation, which is on the left here, and that has some advantages, some disadvantages, and one of them is homomorphic encryption, which I mentioned, which also has advantages and disadvantages. And these have to do with efficiency type, but that means everything in this context. One requires more communication, you know, this one requires more computation. So there was this beautiful work by Anantha and Vinod Vaikuntanathan and Chirag at MIT called Gazelle, where they said, okay, we don't know which method to use. Why don't we use both? We'll alternate levels of a deep net using sort of the linear level. We're going to do a homomorphic encryption, and the non-linear level, we'll do a two-party computation. And this has been recently extended by Raluca Pupa and her group in the RISE lab at Berkeley. It's going to appear in NSDI. It's called Delphi. And she takes this approach and does some interesting tweaks to it. And the main interest there is that she does automated trade-off optimization. So she sort of trades off when is it that we need to do homomorphic encryption and when is it that we do sort of the MPC technology so that we get the best performance. I think it's very interesting how this optimization is done. And in any case, the point here is you can even do neural nets with actually, I don't know how many levels they get, but in the original work, they had up to tens of levels by incorporating both technologies, taking advantage of the good features of each one for at the right time. Last thing, two last points. So as I said, the homomorphic encryption is made a long way since the original paper, theoretical paper that said it was possible. There are libraries out there that do homomorphic encryption. There's HElib, which was the first one. Then there's Dualisade, which is actually by a company called Duality Technologies. There's a very interesting one by a group, the Hin one, by Chion and Al from Korea. And I want to say a word about that one, because what's interesting in what they do, kind of fundamentally, Oh, actually, just in fact, it's been used in the context of GWAS, genome-wide association studies, and the performance is actually quite good, even with 300 patients, 10,000 SNPs, and so forth. What I mean by use is you encrypt those genetic information, and then you run GWAS on the genetic information under encryption, so in a homomorphic encryption way. And you can handle quite a few records. The thing that I want to tell you about the Heen system, which is interesting, is they say the following: homomorphic encryption, you can use it, but it's expensive. It might be practical, and yet it's expensive. It could be better without using it. So they say, instead of insisting on accurate homomorphic encryption, accurate meaning is first I encrypt, then I run my results while it's encrypted, and then I decrypt. And I get the right result exactly. Why don't we do approximate homomorphic encryption? And what they mean is that when you decrypt the result, it's actually not going to be correct. But it's not going to be too incorrect. So it's going to be what it should be plus some error. Now, their observation is that in the context of machine learning, anyway, there's error. So if you did that in the context of machine learning using an approximate homomorphic encryption, which was much faster than the accurate one, you could get a speed up that would be satisfying and enough accuracy. So if you look at this, one is bullseye, one is not, but it might be good enough when you are really dealing with, arithmetic on real numbers to get approximate results, and worth the loss in speed. So why approximation? Because of efficiency. Now, in some new work with Jonathan Frankel, I think gave a talk here yesterday, and Alon and Ran Cohen and Chaim Shaul and Vinod Vaikuntanathan, we say the following: what's the problem with this approach? The problem is that as your computation gets bigger, you have more and more levels, the error grows. So the more you compute, the more inaccurate it gets. So you might get efficiency, but at some point you say, well, it's not good enough. I'm losing so much accuracy that it's not worth it. And the question is, can we control the error? And we say, you know what, there's a lot of work in fault tolerance, right? If you think back to the original von Neumann model that of fixing computation, right? Fault tolerance, Boolean circuits, every gate fails with some probability. And the whole point is how to get around those probability by doing clever redundancy. Here we're in a different story. We can't just use von Neumann's trick because we're talking about real numbers rather than Boolean gates and inputs. So what we need is to develop some sort of fault tolerance for these type of situations. And that's what we do in this work. So we kind of talk about the gates as noisy. Think about model the gates as noisy. That's when you decrypt, you get an error. That's the same as thinking of the gate, a noisy gate. And we have some way to model the errors that happen actually, which are in these gates, which is the errors that happen when you decrypt with this scheme. And then we try to correct it. And that's what we do. So it's just a picture. We have the notion of an average gate rather than redundancy of doing many times and then taking majority like in von Neumann. We do averaging. And at the end, the result of all that is that, in fact, for variance of streaming data, you can beat both the accurate homomorphic encryption because it's too slow. It can't even run on the size of data that we do, and the inaccurate one because the error is low. We can every time the error grows, we can, in some sense, bootstrap and control it by our fault tolerance method. Okay, I think I gave you a big less, too much here. But I think it's an interesting approach. For which computations can you do this fault tolerance? And I think it's quite promising. And there's some implementation results even here for running the well-forward algorithm. So to sum up, I want to say that machine learning challenges actually are a great opportunity for cryptographers because there's a lot of new work to do, very interesting work. And even it's both theoretical and practical. So developing new theory for crypto for machine learning. And that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, so I had a question. So it seems like for the approximate computing case, you're trading off accuracy for computational efficiency. So I guess the first question I would have is like, what is the swing in the computational efficiency that you're like, what are kind of those ranges that you're trading off? Like how much efficiency are you improving when you do approximate computing versus like, is it 10x faster? Is it 2x faster, 100x?
That's a question about really even the original algorithm, the Heen system. I really would need to dig back to tell you, because and the truth is, I guess this is a question really to the audience here. How do you even interpret that? Because you're doing it for a specific application. They show that specific applications, things logistic regression, where they did much better. But I don't want to answer something that is inaccurate. And even for us, when we do this, you know, the theoretical idea is great to do some fault tolerance for these type of errors, for real numbers. But to find an application that's right there in the slice between the accurate, you know, that does better than both the precise and accurate without fault tolerance, you know, it took some work. So again, you know, maybe doing optimization, you know, trying to think of what's the right algorithm to run per application would be a very interesting idea. And then you'd have to answer the kind of question that you're asking.
So thanks a lot. This was very interesting. You mentioned a concept of ML complete. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, so what I mean by that is, you know, that needs to be defined, right? But what I mean intuitively by that is that the functionalities that you do are going to be useful for a class of, so let's say let's take a class of machine learning algorithms, take linear classifiers or something. Say what are the primitive operations that every algorithm that learns linear classifiers has to do. Now, you know, they can be big, they can be small. It's like a you know, a risk computer. You have to define what is a high level enough so that your design is going to be simple. And if you had those building blocks off the shelf. So if it's for, you know, I don't know, CNNs or other kind of architectures for deep nets, again, you would have to define what is the highest abstraction that you feel will get you the generality of what you could have done before with basic operations, and make it simple to build algorithms. Now, when I say the word complete, you know, and one thinks about NP completeness or formal reductions, it would be great that one could show reductions, right? To show that how do you reduce from one task to the other, what would be a complete task, and that requires really more machine learning expertise rather than cryptographic. But what I'm saying is that, first of all, I think it's a great task. But second of all, that when one does that, one more concern besides simplicity and efficiency would be the cryptographic friendliness of it. Meaning that if this operation, if you just say, you just have to do this operation, and then I want these operations to be, rather than AND gate, okay, or ReLU, I want them to be, you know, like a polynomial operation. So like taking something square and then cutting off the polynomial is much easier to evaluate that. If X is encrypted, I can evaluate like EX squared, you know, rather than doing, you know, some kind of other trigonometric function on X. So if those are the basic operations, I want them to be the operations that the choice of them would be take into account which ones are easier to implement under homomorphic encryption.
Thank you.
Yeah, long answer, but I didn't answer your question. But you understand the spirit of what I want from it. But I think it would be very interesting to define that, and you know, what's a complete problem, what's a reduction. Probably be easier to define reductions than find the complete. Yeah, although both of them are tied to each other.
All right, so we're out of time. Let's thank our speaker again, and then we will go start right into the next session.
All right, so continuing the excitement here. So